Good morning. I graduated from vet school in 2005. And for the past 11 and a half years, I've been working in New York City at this place called the Center for Avian and Exotic Medicine. When I tell people that, they're usually very confused. They don't know what that means. I tell them it's a veterinary hospital, but we do not see dogs or cats. We actually don't even let them in the front door. So we see exotic animals only. So then people ask me if I see giraffes and lions and tigers, and I say no, it's not. I'm not a zoo vet. These are exotic pets, so they tend to be smaller exotic animals, and they're privately owned. And we are really busy. There are 3 full-time veterinarians, including myself. We have about 5 licensed veterinary nurses and a bunch of assistants and receptionists. We're open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day. And we turn people away constantly. We can't keep up with the amount of people calling with questions and concerns about their exotic pets. Part of the reason for this is probably it's New York City and we have obviously a large population. And I think a lot of people in cities, there's rules in apartment buildings about having dogs and cats. So a lot of people are not allowed to have a dog or cat, but somehow a pet that is living in a cage is more acceptable. So a lot of our clients want a pet for their family and they go out to the pet store and they end up with an exotic pet. So in veterinary medicine, we also refer to exotic pets as these animals right here: birds, reptiles, small mammals, amphibians, and fish, okay, to differentiate it from zoo animals and farm animals and small animals, which we consider dogs and cats. And our practice is divided. We see about 1/3 birds, 1/3 small mammals, and 1/3 reptiles and amphibians. And I also have the question of why do people own exotic pets? Well, I just gave you one thought about urban populations wanting an animal that's quiet and can live in their home. And obviously, I think there's, these animals are fascinating and beautiful and novel. And for me, I was drawn to exotic pet medicine just because of the medical side of it. There's still so much we don't know about these animals. One of the things I wanted to just put out there right away is this concept of domestication. I think a lot of people are confused by this. I know my students are, and I think people in general, when I ask them, they don't really know what it means. What is the difference between a domesticated animal and a wild animal? So here's an example of the dog. So again, it's a process of selective breeding where humans are basically choosing desirable traits from these animals and then breeding them over many, many generations. And there's debate over how many generations you need to make it officially domesticated, but in general, it's these animals, domesticated animals, no longer resemble their wild counterparts. And certainly our pet dogs don't resemble wolves any longer. So their behaviors are very different. So I'm talking specifically about pet birds today, but this is actually, most exotic pets are not domesticated. But this example here in pet birds, many of them are born in captivity, okay, but their parents or their grandparents were wild caught. And this is important because what it means is these birds, like the parrots you see on this guy's shoulders, I mean, they're exactly the same as their wild cousins, okay? All of their behavior, their instincts, everything, it's still there. I think a better definition for some exotic pets and certainly birds is that they're tame. They are basically used to being around people. They no longer have a fear response to people. I also like bringing this up. I work also at a wildlife rehabilitation center in New York City. It happens to be right across the street from my hospital, so I can stand in my reception area and look across the street right at the storefront. And people are always confused. They say, what do you mean that wildlife in New York City? It's a huge city, but we do get a lot of wildlife, a lot of birds. We're on a migratory corridor on the East Coast where we have a lot of waterfowl. We're a coastal city. We have a lot of resident birds as well. There are nesting pairs of peregrine falcons on every major bridge, and a lot of red-tailed hawks live in the parks. So there's a lot of wildlife. And they come in to the Wild Bird Fund across the street. And the reason I bring this up is because there's just this totally different mentality with our native wildlife. No one would ever think about keeping those birds that they find hurt on the street or in the park as a pet. They're actually not allowed to. We have federal laws that protect our wildlife, but they don't know that. They're bringing it in, and the whole goal is that this bird is going to be rehabilitated, healed, and then released back to the wild. So I think that's a real juxtaposition with my hospital across the street. The birds that we see, the pet birds, they're just wildlife from other countries. That's it. I think about that all the time. It makes me crazy. So I think this is very true, and if you talk to any veterinarian who works with exotic pets, they're going to agree that unfortunately most of the health problems that we see with exotic pets are caused by people or just a direct consequence of these animals being kept in captive environments. And it's really, really sad. You know, I think another reason why my hospital is so busy and people are constantly calling and wanting to come in is that their pets are sick. Like, things have gone wrong at home. They're mistaken. Exotic pets are mistakenly called, you know, low maintenance pets, and it's just not true. They're much more difficult to care for than dogs or cats, and so things go wrong, and people come in, and these animals are so very sick, whether they've been intentionally or unintentionally neglected by the owners. You know, by the time we're seeing them, they're in really, really bad shape. And the owners of these animals often tell me too that they were misled by the pet store. Like, they wanted a pet, they couldn't have a dog or cat. They went to the pet store, and then someone at the pet store told them that this lizard or this bird or whatever it is, guinea pig, was going to be really easy to take care of. And then when they come into the veterinary professionals, we explain to them what they've been doing wrong, and they're really upset, and they're like, how could the pet store have told me that? They lied. That happens all the time. After the first few years of working in this practice, I started to get really depressed, and almost considered not being a veterinarian anymore, because when you just see like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of animals that are just suffering from poor care, it gets to you. So I made a few changes, and I started to do a few other things in the community, and one of the things that really helped me was working in the city shelters. So the Animal Care Center of New York City, that's the major shelter system in the city. And they're mostly a dog and cat shelter, as most shelters are, although they do house and adopt out rabbits, which is kind of unusual. Most exotic pets don't get to actually stay at the city shelters. And that's how I ended up working there. They brought me in to do rabbit checks and also to just consult with them for the exotic pets that get dumped there. And of course, exotic pets get dumped there. They get dumped at pet stores. They get dumped in the park when people don't want them anymore, and they get dumped at the shelter. And the shelter doesn't really have a place for them. And one of the things I learned about the shelter system is that, of course, they work on a budget, and they don't have a whole lot of money for the care of exotic pets. One of the reasons I like working at the shelter is because I'm surrounded by people who really love animals, really care about animals, and that was different from my day-to-day private practice experience. But these are mostly veterinarians and nurses and staff that are used to caring for dogs and cats. So an exotic animal comes in and they're lost. They don't know what to do. So what happens is the shelter acts as kind of a stopover for a night, maybe 2 nights, and then the shelter reaches out to private organizations to basically come and get these animals and transport them out. And unfortunately, then that burden of caring for these unwanted exotic pets falls on private groups that don't have government funding, and they're the ones that have to provide the medical care and ultimately adopt out these animals. And the other thing that I don't like about this system is there's no accountability. The dogs and the cats and the rabbits get adopted out. Something happens and they end up back in the shelter, or they are dumped in a park. They have a microchip, and we can sort of see what happened, like trace it back to the owner, what went wrong, how can we avoid the mistakes, for the animal. And then I just wanted to mention this as well, because I have over the years worked a lot with our SPCA, American SPCA headquarters is in New York City. And I've worked a lot with the local police, obviously, as well, dealing with unwanted exotic pets in our community. And I really like this partnership that started it. So it's new. It's a sort of it's an experiment that's going well, shall I say. In 2014, the ASPCA and the NYPD teamed up, and the NYPD now has its own animal cruelty unit. So they have special training, and essentially what happens is the police officers are the ones that respond to animal cruelty complaints. And then with their special training, they can go in and get a better idea of the situation. And if it is something that they can't handle, they can reach out to their ASPCA friends, and they're the ones that help with the animal care, housing the animals if they need to be taken out of the situation. They also provide the forensics investigation and legal help. So ASPCA legal team will help the prosecuting attorneys. And you can go on the website and read about this a little bit more, but I put these statistics in here. So they 652 animals rescued and received treatment in 2017 and 123 cruelty arrests. I'll be interested to see what the actual outcome of the legal cases are down the road. Okay, so what I'm going to cover in the rest of this talk, just briefly, the types of birds kept in captivity. I think we should talk a little bit about the wild behavior of birds and some of the difficulties of keeping them in captivity. Some of the welfare issues for the owners and for the environment, and potentially some solutions. So a lot of different types of birds are kept as pets, obviously. The cetaceans are probably the most well-known. Those are the parrots, the parakeets. Those are the birds with the hooked bill, the colorful birds. People also keep finches and canaries, chickens and turkeys, quails, pheasants, and then the columbiforms, pigeons, and doves. I'm mainly going to focus on the cetaceans, on the parrots, because in my opinion, those are the ones that are the most difficult to care for. They live for a really, really long time, and they are also the ones that I see most in my practice. So I like throwing this in because I think it's fun, but this is basically agreed upon scientifically at this point that birds are dinosaurs. They They evolved from the meat-eating dinosaurs that walked on 2 legs. And when the big extinction happened 66 million years ago, not all dinosaurs died out. The bird-like dinosaurs survived, and they are still with us. There's just a slide that shows some of the similarities of the respiratory system that dinosaurs and modern birds share. So understanding birds in the wild, I think this is really important. Anyone who's trying to assess the welfare of a bird, you need to understand what their wild behaviors are, because they are wild. They're not domesticated, right? So they are adapted to tropical and subtropical environments. And here in Canada, and certainly in the US as well, we have to, this is really important. If someone is housing a bird outdoors in the winter or in an unheated environment, they're not adapted to that. And that would certainly be considered cruel. So birds are extremely social, parrots especially. So in the wild, they generally live in flocks. The juvenile birds learn how to be birds, how to vocalize, where to eat, where to go to eat from the other birds in the flock. And then when they reach sexual maturity after a few years or so, most of them form monogamous breeding pairs. And those pairs spend a lot of time grooming each other, and obviously the whole entire flock spends time together, and they're very loud. They're calling to each other constantly throughout the day. And then the main point I want you guys to get from this is that parrots are never alone in the wild. So obviously birds are really busy in the wild. They fly many, many miles a day. They forage for food, visiting different trees in different areas, looking for food. Sometimes they are raising young. And then there's probably all sorts of things they do that we don't even know because we can't get up into the canopy of the forest to observe them. So their nutrition is really complex and still poorly understood. We have some information about some species, and some species we still don't know. But in general, they eat seeds and fruits, nuts, pollen, nectar, flowers, insects. Their food is seasonal, so they don't have the same thing at all times of the year. It's obviously very fresh. They have a choice. They have a choice for what they want to eat. And I think because of how complex their nutrition is, I think it's very safe to say this is impossible for us to recreate in captivity. Most people know this, but if you don't, parrots live for a very long time. There's reports of them living over 80 years. I personally have never seen one that old. I don't think they thrive in captivity. So I usually tell owners maybe they'll live 40 years, 50 years if you're lucky. But even that is a really long time. Oh yeah, and there's no reliable way to age a parrot. This is a big deal. They are, okay, so in mammals, we'll often look at their teeth to see how worn the teeth are, and you can get an estimate of age based on that. Birds don't have teeth, and there's really not any good way of knowing how old they are. People ask me all the time, how old is my bird? And I can't answer that. And that's a big deal when you're buying a bird, when you're trying to rehome a bird, to just have no idea whether it's gonna live for 10 more years or 50 more years. So they have a powerful hooked beak. So you can see that African gray parrot there, no problem cracking open a whole walnut. That's not a big deal. And then this guy over here peeling the bark off a tree, probably looking for grubs or insects in there. So what does that mean? It means if they bite you, it really, really hurts. And it also means they can be very destructive in your home. I've seen some damage that birds can do when they're out of their cage to walls and furniture, and yeah. So birds have a unique respiratory system. I bring this up because I do think it's really important, and I'm not going to go into the details of it. But essentially, in addition to lungs, they have this really complex system of air sacs as well. And for every breath we take in and out, birds are essentially taking 2 in and out. Those air sacs almost act like a bellows, so there's constant oxygen flowing through the lungs. And what that means is they're very sensitive to things in the air, in the environment. And most everyone's heard of the canary in the coal mine scenario. What does that mean? Well, it means that if toxic gases were released underground in the mine, the bird would keel over, and then the miners would know to get out. So, and this is important because in our homes, there's so many toxic things, right? So no sexual dimorphism. This basically means we can't tell the difference between males and females in most species. Okay, all their reproductive organs are on the inside, and their colors look the same to us. If you want to know the gender of your bird, you're going to have to take it to the vet and get a DNA test. It's expensive. It requires a blood draw. And again, why is this important? Well, certainly housing birds together, dealing with behavior problems, health problems. And then the other big thing is birds aren't spayed and neutered. We all know, anyone in animal welfare knows that dogs and cats, that there's huge benefits to being spayed and neutered behaviorally and health-wise. And it's really the same for birds, but it's not a routine procedure. It's actually really difficult to spay and neuter birds. In fact, we usually don't do it unless there's a problem already. So they also have a unique digestive tract. So they've got 2 stomachs. The first stomach is kind of like ours, but then they've got this other stomach called the ventriculus, or the gizzard. And it is that round, really muscular, walled stomach. And it's designed to collect grit, so little pieces of mineral density things. So in the wild, they'd probably be picking up little pebbles and things like that. That stomach then collects the grit, and then it crushes the food, and the grit helps to break down the food as it passes through. And you can see over here, I don't think you can see this, the little bird's head would be up here and the legs are back here. This is the accumulation of grit in this bird's second stomach or gizzard. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up, I know you guys you don't need a lesson in bird anatomy and x-rays, but basically birds, when they come out of the cage in your home, they explore their environment. They're constantly using their beak to climb and explore and pick up things, and they swallow things that are toxic. And those things accumulate in their gizzard, and you can see the arrow pointing to this one that looks to be of a metal density. Okay, and we see a lot of metal poisoning from lead paint and just like foreign material like plastic and whatever stuck in these birds' second stomach. And they get really sick, and a lot of them die, and we see it all the time. Feather quality is a big issue in captive birds. So most people don't bathe their bird. I don't know why, but they don't. If you think about the birds in the natural environment, they'd be getting rained on. I think also the poor nutrition often in captivity causes the feather quality to be substandard. Birds do a lot of over-preening of their feathers in captivity. I think probably an attempt to clean them. Also, maybe because they're bored. But in the wild, if the bird's feathers aren't really in perfect condition, they won't be able to fly. And flying is obviously important for survival. So we know that birds are really intelligent. I mean, there's been so many different studies out there about how intelligent they are. They have a very large brain compared to their body size. They have hugely complex social behaviors. We think they have language. I mean, obviously, some parrots can actually speak to us, and they obviously communicate with each other as well. And a lot of people will compare them to a toddler, like a human 2 to 5 year old. So birds are, we believe, the 4th most popular pet after dogs, cats, and fish. We have no idea how many of them there are in captivity. There's estimates, but obviously in the tens of millions. Okay. Unfortunately, most birds don't ever make it to the vet, and their breeding is unregulated. And then, of course, we have black market birds coming in. And then, as was already mentioned and will be mentioned more today, the worldwide industry, or the trade in birds and exotic animals, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there are a lot of parrot misconceptions, okay? And I guess I already mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. The whole idea that they're low-maintenance pets is a lie. Most parrots don't talk, okay? We see the videos, of course, on YouTube of the birds talking and dancing. Okay, most of them just make really loud, annoying, screeching sounds, okay? Some breeds obviously are predisposed to speaking, but, and if you want them to perform tricks, you have to train them. Obviously, they're not just gonna do that. There's also this misconception, and this is perpetuated, unfortunately, by pet stores and breeders, that if you want a pet bird, you have to get it as an unweaned baby. So unweaned just means that it's not feeding itself yet. So it's relying on its parents or the human to feed it at this point. And this is absolutely wrong. Birds that are juvenile or even adult can certainly bond to people. If you want a bird as a pet, it does not have to be a baby bird. And then the very sad truth that most parrots are rehomed just after a few years. People do not know what they're getting into and end up giving these birds away to friends and family. They reach out to bird sanctuaries, which are overwhelmed. They dump them at shelters, they let them go, or if they just can't handle it anymore, a lot of them get locked in a cage and put in the basement or the garage and just never let out of the cage and ignored. So they're extremely loud, right? Their voices have evolved to call over many miles in a rainforest, okay? I can tell you from personal experience that when a bird makes a really loud sound near your ear, it really, really hurts. They're extremely messy, okay? The way that they eat their food, they peel things and bite through the fruit part to get to the seed, and they just throw everything all around. And in the rainforest, who cares? But in your home, it's a problem. I mean, they really have to be cleaned every day. They require a lot of space to fly, climb, and exercise. I think that's fair. They're intelligent, right? So they need social, mental stimulation. They have some pretty interesting diet or nutrition requirements. They need a fume and toxic-free environment. Most people who own birds would say that they are demanding. They can be aggressive. They can be unpredictable. And then, of course, the one thing that nobody probably thinks about when they go out and they impulse purchase an exotic pet is there a veterinarian in your community that will help you if your pet gets sick? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is often no. If you live in a smaller city, you're not going to have a hospital like mine available. Most veterinarians, to keep the business going, they really focus on dogs and cats. And these exotic pets and birds, I mean, their health problems are very, very different from dogs and cats. So those veterinarians may not be willing to even see your exotic pet or bird. Bird mills exist, just like puppy mills. These are very sad places. We're going to talk a little bit more about them. Most animal welfare legislation does not include birds. That is true. So we talked about how they form these monogamous breeding pairs, and they will do that with their human companions. So they will often bond very, very strongly to one person in the family, and then they become extremely aggressive towards others. And then there are bird sanctuaries out there. I work with a bunch of them in the Northeast, and I can tell you that they are overwhelmed at capacity, and every day they get more and more calls for people trying to get rid of their bird. I threw this in here because I make my students watch this. We watched this in one of our first bird classes. It's a short documentary. It's about an hour long, called Parrot Confidential, and it's really good. It's a nice summary of some of the issues with avian welfare in captivity. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over animal welfare concepts because a lot of our other speakers, that's their specialty. But when we're assessing bird welfare, I just wanted to bring up some of the basic things so we can focus on them. So the 5 freedoms is obviously been around for a long time. So freedom from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition, freedom from disease and injury, freedom from physical and thermal discomfort, freedom from fear, distress, and negative psychological states, and the freedom to carry out most normal forms of behavior. So we can think about these basic concepts of animal welfare now with birds. And then just this paper out of the University of British Columbia, I think is, again, it's important not to just consider the welfare of the animal, but we also need to think about the welfare of others, so that's the owners, people in the community, and then obviously the environment. So we're gonna touch on those things a little bit. Okay, this is the audience participation point. Who here, knowing what you know now about birds and birds in the wild, thinks that this is an appropriate cage environment for a bird? Anybody? Okay. Is anyone willing to criticize this cage environment? Anything you would think is wrong?
What they just said, it's way too small. You need like probably minimum 4 by 4 and probably 6 feet up.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most striking thing about it. I mean, I don't even know if this bird can fully extend its wings, so obviously it's way too small. Anyone else?
There's no enrichment?
There's no enrichment. Yeah, that's great. There's no toys. I mean, there's barely room in there anyway, but yeah, there's nothing for this bird to do.
Cage is outside, so there's no temperature control.
Right. We have no idea what sort of temperature this bird is being kept at, and whether it could get rained on.
There's no protection from anything?
Right. Yeah, so no protection from, well, so there's no place for this bird to hide. Like if it got scared, a predator or something came up. Yeah, good one. Anyone else?
Got no companion.
No companion, yeah, that's a good one. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of that right away. But you're right, they do much better with a companion. That's great, yeah.
There should be multiple perches of different sizes and textures.
Yeah, correct. So you can see that perch is just a very uniform size, and that's the only perch option that bird has. We see a lot of problems with birds housed with perches like that. They actually get sores and things on the bottom of their feet because their feet can't ever move. They're constantly locked in this position around that perch. So yeah, excellent.
The feeders seem very low down because they're so messy and
Yeah. Yeah, excellent, excellent. So you can see the bowls are on the bottom, okay? Birds poop all the time. They're constantly eating, they're constantly pooping. So the food and water would get soiled almost immediately in this sort of setup. Okay, you guys did really, really well. So I also question how safe that wire of the cage is. It looks a little flimsy to me, and also keep in mind a lot of metal, a lot of wire, especially is galvanized. It's coated with zinc. And if it gets old or a little bit rusty and the bird uses its beak to climb around the cage, little pieces of zinc are going to go in its mouth, and then it's going to get really sick. And then I think the rest of the stuff you guys talked about. Ability to clean. I mean, there's not much to that cage, but certainly that's important. Yeah, good job. So here's a slightly better setup, okay? Let's see, we can say much better setup. You can see there's a little Amazon parrot over here, so you can see how large this cage is for that bird. So that's great. There's lots of toys. It's by a window, so there's some natural light, but also inside, so protected from the weather. And you can see he or she has this play stand over here, so when that bird is out of the cage, they can go over and, you know, there's toys and things to do, climbing things. And then, of course, not in the winter, but in the summer months, you know, maybe an outdoor aviary would be great for these birds. Something that's a little larger like this, so they could actually fly. Yeah.
So I don't know if you're gonna. This is gonna come up, and I'm getting ahead. I've heard that there are human health risks associated with birds. That you are as likely to contract lung cancer as if you are a smoker if you have birds in the house because the dander is, and you're not keeping up on maintenance. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I don't think lung cancer is really what the problem is. But yes, there are some health risks of things birds can transmit to people, and we are going to talk about that. Yeah. But I'll try and remember the lung disease one. Okay, this is another audience participation slide. Who thinks that this is a good balanced diet for a bird? Okay, hopefully no one. Any thoughts? Any criticisms?
Birds are super picky, right? So, like one seed, it'll pick the one seed and eat nothing but the one seed and leave everything else behind. So, unfortunately, as crappy as it is, for cage bird manufactured diets are usually most recommended by veterinarians because at least it provides a consistency.
Right.
Bird supplements and
Right.
diet.
Yeah. Very good. So what she mentioned is the bird might just pick out one thing from this mix and throw the rest on the floor. Yeah.
If anything's not native to what they would have eaten in the wild, they would know what not to eat and what to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah.
You don't have any fruits or insects?
Mm-hmm.
No bird gravel?
No bird gravel. Okay. Yeah, so good point. So this is obviously the typical bird seed mix that you see at the pet store. It's high oil seeds, cheap seeds to produce. They're dried out. That bag's probably been sitting on the shelf for a while. Corn, dried corn. Okay, so this isn't really adequate nutrition for a bird. And these are some of the problems with the all-seed diets. So yeah, they pick out their favorite foods, and when they're only eating this type of diet from the veterinary side of it, we see vitamin deficiencies, calcium deficiencies, and obviously these are really high-fat seeds, and these birds are, most of them, just sitting in a cage all day, so they're just sitting there eating, and they're just getting fatter and fatter and fatter, and this causes all sorts of health problems. So one option are these commercial pellets that they make now. And these are widely available. They're basically ground up grains fortified with vitamins and minerals. They can look kind of like breakfast cereal. You know, those are different brands. So some of them are colored, some of them are just brown. So, you know, some of these commercial pellets, and then the birds should be offered fresh fruits, vegetables, healthy grains, healthy seeds, nuts, maybe some sprouts. And then the gentleman up here mentioned grit. There's some debate about grit. I've seen a lot of birds when the owners offer them grit, they overeat the grit and get sick from that. So it may be that birds can do without grit if they're in captivity, if they're on this type of diet. Yeah, we don't know. And then there's obviously a whole list of toxic things for birds. It's important to know. You may not think of avocado, but chocolate, caffeine, alcohol, extremely salty foods, extremely oily, high-fat foods. And then birds will eat anything, right? If any of you have ever had a bird, they are truly omnivores, and they will eat anything. But if it's junk food, if it's bad for you, it's probably bad for your bird as well. Freedom from injury and disease, okay? Most people don't train their birds. I don't understand. People get a dog and they train their dog. They teach it how to sit, how to walk on a leash, how to not go to the bathroom in the house. But people don't train their birds, and it's a problem. It's a huge problem. So keeping them safe, I mean, unfortunately, I really think it's important that the bird is in a cage when no one's there. And most of my clients, because their birds aren't trained, they can't get the bird back in the cage when they need to go out. It tries to bite them or it flies away. So they leave it out, and then really bad things happen. And then also when you're there, hopefully you're allowed to let the bird come out of the cage and for some enrichment, some out of the cage time. You still need to watch them. They're like toddlers. They get into trouble. Yeah. And then in addition to toxic foods, there's also things in our homes that are very toxic to birds. Okay, Teflon. Most people don't know that. That's the non-stick coating on cookware, on pans, cooking pans. That stuff, if you heat it up and there isn't food in the pan, it releases a toxic gas, and it kills birds instantly. It happens all the time. We have clients call us all the time hysterically. My bird just is drop dead because it came in the kitchen when I was cooking. And then obviously chemicals, cleaners, smokes, okay. And I mentioned lead paint again. Depends on where you are, but in New York we see a lot of lead poisoning because the buildings are very old and have lead paint on them. And then this one again, access to veterinary care. I mean, this is really an important part of animal welfare, right? Freedom from injury and disease. Like, you need a veterinarian to help you. Like, chances are something's gonna happen at some point. Something's gonna happen to that bird. Freedom to express normal behaviors. Okay, so I would say that flying is a really important normal behavior in birds, probably like walking to us. Okay, but so many bird owners come into us and they ask us to clip the bird's wings. Okay, so this is where, so normally there would be more feathers down here. Okay, that would look like this part of the wing. But what we do is we cut about half the length of those primary wing feathers off. Okay, and this means that the bird can't fly. I mean, they can't get up and they can't go long distances. We obviously don't want them to crash to the ground if they jump off something. So it's actually, there's some finesse to performing a correct wing trim. But people want this because it makes their birds easier to handle. But there's some, there's some animal welfare debates, concepts about whether this is okay. First of all, it means the birds can't exercise anymore. I mean, sure, they can climb around a little bit, but flying is like their main way of exercising. So they can't exercise. And then psychologically, if all of a sudden you couldn't use your legs anymore, what does that mean? You've lost control over your environment. If you got scared and you felt like you had to get away from a predator, you wouldn't be able to do that. So yeah, psychologically, what effect does this have on birds? And it's really common. I do it because owners, they feel like their bird will be unsafe if it's able to fly. Yeah?
Don't the feathers grow back after clipping?
They will grow back. So birds molt or grow new feathers, maybe a couple times a year. So after we trim it, it could be 6 months before they grow back or even longer. But yes, they do grow back. So sometimes we'll say, okay, I'm doing this now, I'm clipping the wings for you now, but this is your chance. Train your bird and then let's let the wings grow back in. Because the other problem is when we cut these here, there's like the sharp shaft of the feather, and when the bird tucks its wings and sits in a normal position, those sharp tips of the wings kind of hit the body, and I think it bothers some of them, and they start to like pick their feathers and overgroom, and then that can turn into a whole big problem. Yeah.
Do you find that with birds that have this trend that the decrease in their muscle mass affects their health overall?
Absolutely. So that's a really good point. If they can't fly or they can't flap, they lose their muscle strength, and they're also really clumsy. Like they tend to have more accidents. They'll like fall, they'll slip off a perch and fall. So where do people get their pet birds? Well, unfortunately, they're not going to the local animal shelter and adopting them. It's usually a pet store or a breeder. I would say that's the most often where I see people getting their birds. Although a lot of people get their birds from family and family members and friends. So someone just can't take care of the bird anymore. Someone in the family passes away, and the bird sort of gets passed around until someone's able to take care of it. So yeah, so they may not have chosen this pet, but it ends up as their pet. It's their grandmother's or their cousins or something like that. Sometimes people do find birds outside, but very, very rarely do they ever rescue birds from sanctuaries, okay? So sanctuaries, many of them will adopt birds out, but they are very careful who they adopt to. There's no impulse adoption, okay? They will really, really vet the people and be sure that they know what they're getting into owning a pet parrot. So I'll actually, we have a history form that new clients fill out when they're coming in. And one of the very first questions we ask is, where did you get your bird? So I'm basing this slide kind of on my personal experiences. But I often will get, on that first line, people will write rescue. And I get really excited thinking they've adopted the bird from a sanctuary. But what they actually mean is that they went to a pet store and they saw a bird in a cage, and it was in a really small cage and it was dirty, and they felt so bad for the bird that they had to rescue the bird from the pet store. Okay, but they actually paid money for the bird, probably $800 or $1,000, okay? So they're reinforcing the pet store, and they're also impulse purchasing a bird, a parrot that's gonna live for 50 years. Oops. Parrot mills. I feel like people don't know these exist. I mean, they are completely unregulated. Why would you? I worked in a parrot mill. In my 4th year of vet school, I did an externship. I didn't really know. My professor sent me off to this place. I didn't really know what it was, and I certainly didn't understand the implications at the time. It was in Florida. Basically, the way these places work is they have breeding pairs of parrots. They're housed in outdoor aviaries, very small, I mean, just like the very minimum sort of environment so that these birds will actually breed. Those birds are probably either wild caught, or if they're not, if they were born in captivity, they're totally wild behaving. They're not tamed. They're not good pets at all. They're not handled. They're scared of humans, okay? So they'll lay an egg, and most of them also, because they're just really not in a very good environment, they won't incubate the egg or even raise the baby. So humans have to go in. They take the eggs away, incubate them, and then when the babies are born, they're sort of loaded up into these plastic bins, and there's like a warehouse full of all these bins of baby birds. And then somebody comes around, actually teams of people come around with the hand feeding formula in a syringe, and they syringe feed these baby birds however many times a day they need it. And then when the birds have fledged, when they get their feathers on them and they don't need to be fed quite as often, they're loaded up into trucks, okay? And they're still not weaned, right? They're still not feeding themselves. They're loaded up into trucks, and the trucks head out to the pet stores. The truck driver has to pull over to the side of the road and hand feed the baby birds because, you know, they need it every few hours. And then they go to the pet store, and the pet store employees maybe are feeding the baby birds, and then obviously the owner. And this is a huge problem because hand feeding baby birds is really difficult. Okay, the formula has to be made up a certain way. It has to be 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It has to be clean. The syringes you use have to be clean. You have to put the syringe in the right place. Like, you don't want to shove it down the bird's trachea. And it has to be, you have to feed the appropriate amount at the appropriate times, or the bird it isn't going to gain weight and develop normally. So there's a lot of complications with these hand-raised chicks, okay? Crop burn is one of them. So this is where people either heat the formula up too high, or they put it in the microwave and it has these sort of irregular pockets of heat. And you can see here, this is actually where, so the birds have a crop, right? It's this sort of outpouching of their esophagus where the food goes in before it goes into the first stomach. So that the formula will burn the crop, and you'll actually get like a fistula, an opening where food pours out on the outside of the bird. So that's what this hole is, and we have to surgically correct that. And then, of course, bacterial and fungal infections, you know, from dirty formula and syringes, malnutrition, you know, they're not getting the right amount, and of course, death. Just for those of you who work with, who may work with birds, or who are in the ASPCAs or rescue groups, signs of a sick bird. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but these are just a few things to look out for. So if you're going into a pet store, if you're going into a facility of some sort, you want to look for birds that are down at the bottom of the cage, okay? They're too weak often to perch. They know they're going to fall, so they come down and they sit on the bottom of the cage. Usually their feathers are all fluffed up because they're having trouble maintaining their body temperature. They're cold. Some of them might be breathing really heavily. You might see them working really hard to breathe. You might see nasal or eye discharge. Their eyes sort of get this really sunken in appearance. And certainly if you, as a person, are going up to a bird and the bird doesn't know you, it should be very alert. It should be looking at you like, okay, who is this strange person? What are they going to do? If it's just sitting there with its eyes closed, obviously it's a sign that, that it's not well. And then missing feathers. And then, you know, we could talk about this one for a really long time. This is the, you know, the famous feather picking or feather destructive behavior that birds do. It's really, really sad. This is probably the most frustrating thing I see as a veterinarian when people bring in their birds and they're pulling out their feathers, and in the worst case scenarios, they're actually mutilating themselves. This bird up here, the green conure, you know, chewed a hole in its wing here. And these clients are, you know, they're wealthy. It's a married couple. They don't have kids. The birds are their kids. He's got other birds at home with him. This bird's name is Connor. Great diet, routine veterinary care, and you know, beautiful cage environment, toys. Just, you know, you would think the most ideal captive bird environment possible, right? And he just one day chewed a hole in his wing. And of course, they're spare no expense type owners. So we did blood tests. We screened him for infectious diseases. He got x-rays. He got fecal exams. We did cultures. We did skin biopsies. You know, there's no medical reason that we can tell why he does this. And that's what's frustrating about this problem is people bring them in and they think, oh, my bird has mites, so it's itchy and it's pulling out its feathers, or, you know, there are certainly a lot of different health problems that have been associated with this behavior in birds. But 99% of the time, we run a whole bunch of tests and we cannot find a medical reason for this. So it is fairly widely accepted that this is a behavioral problem. It's a psychological thing. Maybe it's like an OCD, nail biting. People have also likened it to people who cut themselves. Okay, and so if you see a bird like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in like an abusive environment, but it's a clue that things are not going well, obviously. If you have to pick up a bird, yeah?
Sorry, just that bird you were just talking about, did it improve? Did they make any changes?
We're still working on it. This is a case just from like a week or two ago. Yeah.
Would you recommend like any environmental changes or anything?
Well, right now he's in the hospital because his owners can't bandage the wings and give him the medications and stuff. I mean, that's something people don't think about. Like, if your bird gets sick, how are you going to get a medicine into it? It's really hard. Yeah.
Is it a human-caused situation, or do wild birds? Is it found in wild birds?
So no. So if birds pulled out their feathers in the wild, they would not be able to fly, and they couldn't find food, and they'd get picked off. So no, this is something we see in captive birds. We're still trying to understand it. It's very common. And it's funny because owners, when I first started practicing, I was always tried to be really nice to everyone and to not say shocking things. And now I don't care. And so people will come in and they'll bring in this bird and they'll be like, oh yeah, he's been pulling his feathers out for like a year and a half. Can you fix him? I'm just like, no. I mean, whatever, we talk about all the different things, but ultimately no. And I'll tell them, I'm like, unfortunately this is something that happens to captive birds. And I'll say, I really don't think they should be pets. And then at first I used to worry that people would get offended by that and they would be like, how could you say that? But most of the time when I say things like that and I'm very direct with people, they look at me and they're like, yeah, like they agree. They love their bird, but they recognize that it shouldn't really be a pet. Yeah.
Obviously, doing what we do for a living, we run into a lot of animals that are in obviously the worst state of care that they could possibly be in. I'm a huge bird lover personally. I would never purchase one, but obviously I've had multiple large bird species come through my care, whether that be for rehab purposes because they were unadoptable. And feather plucking has always been a massive issue that I've dealt with continuously over and over and over and over and over again. Pretty much, anytime they're coming into my house is because they're naked and nobody wants them, and they're frustrated and angry and all the list of issues. And I'd be really interested to get your opinion on it. But one bird in particular that was super horrible with feather plucking. And with all the environmental and all the possible changes that we could ever do for her, it was one day I was watching her pupils dilate repeatedly over and over and over again, and she looked really uneasy. It was just the way she was sitting. And then I started to make the correlation that the bars on the cage, if you were to sit inside of a dog crate, you wouldn't be able to focus past the bars in front of your face. Yet all the bird cages available on the market are barred, and I get that's for ventilation purposes. But as soon as I took her out of an environment where she had to look through bars, she stopped plucking. And I have not had another bird come into my care that was dealing with this that didn't stop plucking when I stopped forcing them to look through bars.
Well, what you're touching on is this is a really complicated behavior, because certainly there's birds who don't really live in cages or spend very little time in cages that do it as well. There isn't like one simple answer. I'm happy to talk to you more about it as well, maybe in the coffee break or something. Yeah. Yeah.
What is your advice if you have those pet owners that have acknowledged that the animal they have is not a good pet, but they realize that it's now their responsibility to maintain the care? What do you say to them?
Right. Well, some of them recognize that they made a big mistake, but that they take responsibility for it, and they just do the best they can. The majority attempt to rehome the bird, so they don't want to deal with it anymore.
Yeah, we should get close to wrapping up.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. These are all really, really good questions, but I have to go faster now.
We'll have questions over coffee.
Yeah. I'll be around all day. And again, for those of you who have to go into a situation, you need to pick up a bird. This is the way we recommend doing it. We call it the towel technique. So you're basically, draping the towel over the bird. You're gently grasping it around its neck. You're not squeezing and strangling the bird, obviously. You're sort of supporting the base of the head so that it can't sort of get its head down and bite you. You never want to put pressure around the bird's body. They breathe by sort of moving their keel bone in and out. And then the towel is great because it keeps their wings tucked in and it gives their feet something to grab onto. And they can be transported in just regular plastic dog and cat crates if you have to get them out. Okay, welfare of others. Okay, so birds we've already talked about, they're very unpredictable. They have a very powerful beak, okay? Any person who's had a bird has probably been bitten by their bird at some point. And depending on the severity of the bite, they may either just handle that or they may want to rehome the bird. And I think this is most important when the parrot is not trained and it's not socialized. So it's bonded to this one person and no one else has bothered to work with it. So when other people come to the house or the family comes around, that bird gets really aggressive and tries to bite others. That's actually my face. I went to our nurses, one of the nurses I work with has a bunch of birds, and I went to her house for dinner, and one of her birds just flew off its cage, which is something it never does, and it just landed on my shoulder and started biting my face. And then this is a message that I got on my desk a week or so ago. This is a client of ours named Anna, who has a bird named Kahu, and my receptionist's handwriting is not so great, so I'm going to read it. Kahu has been extremely aggressive, bit her ear, worried she may have to rehome, please call. Okay, every day, okay. We'll do questions after, okay. Is the animal's life expectancy so great that the owner may lose the commitment or ability to provide care throughout its life? I'm gonna just go with yes, okay? Because things change. People don't think about the future. They don't think about the fact that they might move or get married or have kids or get sick or die. And these birds live for a really, really long time. This alone, in my opinion, makes parrots unsuitable companions because who takes care of them when their owner dies? Yeah. Just to touch quickly on infectious diseases. So birds, yes, they can carry many types of infectious diseases. This is just a really short list up here. So there are zoonotic diseases that they can carry. So those are diseases that can be transmitted from birds to humans. And then there's also, obviously, birds can transmit disease to other birds. And this is important. But I'm going to skip over it a little bit more. We're almost at the end. And then risks to the environment, of course. So there's this false notion that if we breed these animals in captivity, that all of a sudden the countries where these animals are wild caught are going to stop catching or stop taking baby birds out of their nests and trying to sell them. Yeah, so the marketing of captive bred birds increases the demand for birds as pets. So therefore, it increases the incentive for illegal and legal trapping of birds in the wild. And it's really sad because, as we know, and we're going to talk about this more in the afternoon, upwards of 70% of these birds don't make it. You know, they don't make it through the smuggling process. Most captive birds have poor welfare, are unsuitable companions to owners, and their trade sale cause significant harm to themselves and the environment. This is my opinion. I'm not saying that there aren't birds out there that have great owners and great homes and aren't happy, but for every one of those, there's probably like 1,000 or more cases where the birds are really neglected, abused, and are miserable. Okay, my email's at the bottom there. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk after, and also you can email me. Thank you.